Okay, we're on.
Great, thank you. All right, welcome everybody. This is the 12 FAR working group. One of our regularly scheduled meetings open to the public. Based on mayor's emergency orders, we're able to conduct meetings via Zoom, so that's the way we're conducting business. Today we have two agenda items. One is to sort of focus in on just specifically the state issue. Kind of the mandate of this working group was to look at city issues, but it came up in our group conversations that we wanted to try to tackle some of the state concerns as well. So I want to take a look at that and see where this group wants to head in what direction with the state concerns as separate from the city concerns. And then the second agenda item is to sort of debrief on the panel discussion we had and see if that provides us any guidance as to specific topics we want to cover and discuss in our future meetings. Is everybody okay with that? And I'll just remind everybody that the working group members will treat this as a committee meeting. We'll have working group members have a dialogue about issues. And then once we reach a point of a conclusion of our discussion, we'll open up for public questions if there are any questions from the public. All right. And just to remind everybody that, because I see a couple of community board members on here, the working group members are me as chair, Carrie Keenan, Roberta Barnett, Vera Brembett, and David Solnak. The other community board members are here as public participants. All right. So any questions so far? All right, let's look at then what is happening at the state level. So earlier on, when we first started this committee or this working group, I sent around the actual specific language of what was being proposed at the state level, which reads that except as otherwise provided in and determined under zoning law, ordinance, or resolution of a city with a population of 1 million or more, the floor area ratio shall not exceed 12.0. There's also a clause in there recognizing that if consultation with local officials as provided in a general project plan of the New York State Urban Development Corporation could also exceed 12.0. So just to be clear, that means that cities over 1 million, if they have zoning in place to allow higher density, then the higher density could occur. All right. So let's just keep that in focus. At previous conversations, we had debates about the 12 FAR serves as a guardrail and protections against the city overdeveloping in residential capacities. And we also had conversations about the fact that the state shouldn't be dictating local zoning, and the home rule advocates were opposed to any sort of language that restricts local zoning and local development. So we have two sides of that issue. As far as I know, all of this is now off the table as of now, but Roberta is somebody who follows this much more closely, so I've asked her to give us a brief update on where things stand at the moment with the state. So Bobby, can you give us a few?
Sure. Hello from Albany. I think that most folks here have heard, but if you have not, the housing policy items that were in the budget that included the governor's, marquee housing policies for supply, they've been removed from the budget. And so that includes the bill that would have repealed the floor area ratio requirement on the state level and then for the UDC. And that means that it is no longer an immediate policy question. However, I will note that it is absolutely still possible for the legislature, if a member so desired, to put forth this bill. They could do that and pass it outside of the budget. It is not necessarily clear that that would occur. I don't believe that we have any precedent for someone carrying that bill, so it's not particularly likely, nor have I heard about anyone bringing it up. And then just because this has been an ongoing repeat issue for the past couple of years, I would anticipate that there will likely be a similar bill that will reappear in future legislative sessions. So even though there may not be an imminent sort of thing to address. That does not mean that there will not be at some point in the not so distant future. It doesn't say anything definitive, but that's sort of where we are. With regard to, I'm just going to note that there was a commercial conversions proposal that has gotten a little bit more traction, specifically to allow certain commercial conversions that are not currently authorized buildings as recently built as 1990. And while that is out of the budget, that could also pass outside of the budget. And those would preserve the floor area ratio, just like the existing conversions do today, which would allow for commercial buildings to convert to residential at a floor area ratio of greater than 12. So it's a little bit different, but it is somewhat related.
Great, thanks, Bobby. Appreciate that. Carrie,
quick question. Yeah,
go ahead.
Sorry, just because I can't seem to find the raise hand. Can you just clarify the 1990 date? That they're saying now that it can be after 1990 and before it was pre-1990? Is that the change, the proposed change, or the sort of proposed change?
The current authorization provides sort of relaxed multiple dwelling law requirements for buildings throughout New York City up to the year 1961, and then technically to 1977, but the city has only adopted up to 1977 south of Murray Street, so not in this district at all. And then the proposed language that the governor provided with input from the city was to extend the same regulatory relief to buildings that were, I believe it was occupied on or before 1990. So that would bring in some of the newer buildings and would allow some of those garment district buildings that I know there's some interest in converting, allowing them to have the regulatory relief that would facilitate their conversion.
Thank you. And do you know by any chance if, you know, what the affordable housing component is to that? Is it the standard?
So with the conversions, there is no mandatory affordability. And if they are to, I guess, expected to have affordability, that would largely be paid for with some sort of tax incentive program. And the governor did propose a tax incentive program. It is the city's language. It is entirely possible that that could pass. And that I believe the terms of that are I think it's a 20% affordability at a weighted average of 70% of area median income. But that obviously could change depending on what the legislators would like to do. If they decide to ultimately pass this, they might decide not to. And then there are other tax incentives that could facilitate this, including if the state decided to extend or renew the existing J51 rehabilitation tax credit, which would also mandate a certain amount of affordability.
Thank you.
But just to be clear, all of this is now struck. It's not happening today. As of now, it's off the books. Christine, I see your hand up. I'll come to you in 1 second. David, I want to follow up with you then, because one of the earlier conversations we had was to say, maybe what we as a group and make a recommendation to the full board is to say, there's a triggering mechanism. If this were to change in the future, then the city has to have a plan in place, which, you know, long-term planning was something that came up pretty strong in the panel that doesn't exist in our city. So what are your thoughts on that?
Oh, I mean, I think there should be a trigger. And I think actually the trigger, I mean, I know there's a lot of people concerned about losing the state cap, right? And you know, I think we all understand the issue there. And so, you know, I think the most rational trigger to begin with is one that just replaces the state cap with an identical city cap, so that there's no change, but it's just now under city control instead of under state control. And then that would be followed by a mandatory review of how to, you know, introduce some new zoning to replace that cap, but that cap wouldn't be replaced until that new zoning was worked out. But one very important exception to that, because it came out in the last meeting that the state that the loss of that cap, the state cap, would mean the loss of a cap on state projects, because that is now controlling projects that aren't governed by city zoning, but rather by the state zoning. And so I think that trigger, however we fashion it, should be done so that the state cap does remain in some way for state projects, so that we don't have that override, that potential override of city zoning.
Yeah, that's an interesting challenge to tackle, is to say that the GPP can't override local city zoning, but that's a good concept, but it's got to be a tough one to push, I think.
May I just offer one point of information, just that the UDC can override, just not for residential. So my understanding is a commercial component they're able to do, just not for residential.
Correct. Yeah, that's what I understand too. And that maybe that is something we'll reinforce. Viren?
Well, just a quick sort of question, both for you, Paul and Roberta. Originally, this 12 cap increase was triggered by the fact that state was thinking about converting existing office buildings to residential, and many of those buildings already had much higher FAR use in place. I think the main trigger was only for that purpose, and then it became much bigger. So, Roberta, what you're saying is that state is going to still pursue that? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, there's a separate element in the zoning resolution in the city, and I mean, this would also have to be adopted at the state level, but for the preservation of floor area when you convert from commercial to residential, and that the floor area ratio cap and removing it could certainly apply in those cases, but there is it's not necessary in order to promote conversions alone.
Understood. I mean, that's a good thing to keep in mind, because our district potentially has a pretty large number of commercial vacancies. And if that conversion does take place, our district and similar districts to us would be largely affected much more than the wider city. So that is something that we should keep in mind as one of the sort of key points.
Yeah, Baron, I remember asking that question specifically of George Janes and Ann Levin at our panel about conversion of commercial space that's a greater density than 12 FAR. Could all of that space be converted to residential? And the answer I got was yes. So the conversion of commercial to residential can exceed 12 FAR from what I understand, but I had 100% clarification on that.
No, which is why sorry, go ahead.
We just need, it depends on the age of the building right now. So if you wanted, for example, to convert like one of the buildings in Hudson Yards to residential, you would need to either implement some sort of regulatory change at the state level or lift the cap, because those wouldn't be captured by any of the existing frameworks.
Okay.
So, Paul, there's a little disconnect here. The state has approved that level of conversion. City has not taken any such position as far as I know. But the whole push was that if you already have a building which has a 33 FAR usage, and if you want to convert that to residential, there is no mechanism in place. The state made that possible by saying that that's not going to be a problem. I don't know the city side of it, for example.
Okay, thanks. Christine.
Yeah, this is all very challenging and confusing, etc. I don't know whether it wouldn't be a suggestion is to start with what we have in CB4 that we think could or should converted, and then work backward into, what is it state? Is it city? Where is it, etc.? And what are the triggers? Because it's such a vast subject, right? And we are looking at all those aspects. But you know, in our neighborhood, there are only a handful of properties that really are a target, would be a target. And we would certainly want to keep that as a very small number, very constrained, right? We don't want that to bleed over to other part of the district. And the part I'm talking about is Hudson Yard North, where there are so many of the properties which are zoned for commercial and which already have the zoning very high FAR, but are not being developed because of the market. And if we could take those property and define, you know, a ring around them of these are the only property we want to have, and therefore these are the rules around them, then we can work into what Roberta is talking about, which are where does it land as far as legislation. So that's my 2 cents.
Thanks. Yeah, I think that goes onto the next level of, like, you know, auditing the land, which is something we've been discussing, and what's city versus state. But my question today is still about, you know, as the working group, we were charged with looking at city local zoning, and a lot of us wanted to talk about the state issues and whether or not we should make a statement about the state proposal. So what I'm wanting to talk about is, now that the state has basically killed all of the proposals on housing policy, can we just, as a group now, just focus on some of those local issues? What are the triggers? Where do we want to do it? What is the audit? How do we do a review of what's developable? What could we gain? And just basically now say, we're going to develop a plan for the city, and we're going to just copy the state, so that if the state ever does bring this back up again, we have a position of where this community board stands on housing density that's greater than 12 FAR. Carrie?
Just for clarification for me, I mean, it gets even more complex when we talk about commercial conversion versus just lifting the cap, right? So are we now talking about commercial conversion? Or are we talking about everything? Like, is it worthwhile to potentially split these up? And is it worth it to split these up and have like a conversation around commercial conversion, and then a conversation around, I suppose, all zoning?
I mean, yes, I think that Carrie, is a good idea. That what we do is, what I'm trying to get to the answer for today is, do we feel it's necessary for the board to now send a letter to the state saying anything about the 12 cap, now that the 12 cap has been off the table, right? So we can just, as a working group, we can just move forward and say, okay, we want to talk about commercial conversions. We want to talk about higher density housing and existing high density zones. We want to talk about develop, you know, like, we can now structure what David has referred to as sort of that trigger, right? If this comes back up again in the next budget cycle, or if in some other legislative proceedings this comes up, we're going to have a plan in place already, so that when that comes up at the state level, right, much like we're doing with Hudson Yards West, with the conversation about development beyond residential at Western Rail Yards, we as a board have said, don't think about anything else there but what's already in place. So this working group could come forward with a plan and say, this is the plan that we want to put in place if the state ever talks about removing the cap again.
So just to go back to your first question, when you say, do we need to respond to the state? I'm sorry, just to be really specific, is that about like, thank you for not lifting the cap? Or,
no, it's, we say nothing.
Or are you saying, right, so I'm not sure. Okay, so we've decided we're saying nothing? Sorry, I thought you asked for a...
That is the question I'm asking of this working group, is whether or not, because the mission of the working group was stated by the chair of the board, which not all of us agreed with the mission. was that we were supposed to focus specifically on city issues. At our first meeting, we talked about issues and people were concerned that we should be talking about the state issue as well as the city issue. And so I set up today's meeting to talk about how do we address the state issue, but now the state issue is off the table. So do we just want to say the state issue is off the table for us as well, so that we can just move to the next step of the working group planning and say, let's start addressing some of the city issues, which includes a long list. So I'm asking the working group to say whether or not we make a statement to the state or not. And that's the question. So let's go to Bobby and then Viren.
So to answer your question, Paul, I think it may likely make sense to think about how to look at this in a city level, unless if there were to be future iterations of a FAR cap proposal, if there are certain stipulations that the board would be interested in seeing in such a proposal, that is the only case in which I think it would make sense to opine to the state level. I think that the FAR cap is not particularly well understood, and I would say that, kind of seems to have a mixture of ambivalence to antipathy from most residents who can kind of live in Manhattan, because I think that there are beliefs that density itself is a burden. So I don't think that it, creating a particular position on whether or not to do it it makes necessarily make sense. It makes sense to just kind of think, like, if this were to come, what would we want to see here?
Viren?
Yeah, I agree with Roberta. I think you don't answer a question that hasn't been asked, because the question can change and then we might look unnecessarily sort of more preemptive. I don't know exactly how to sort of respond to you, but my personal gut feeling is we should just simply think about what it is that we want to do as a kind of task force within Community Board 4, and we can tackle those questions within ourselves, but writing letters is a kind of slightly different scenario. The second thing that I had to sort of state for clarity's sake is the 12 FAR cap removal actually was triggered because of commercial vacancy conversions, very much so. And somehow it got conflated, and there are two schools of thought. And I think because of the housing push and housing affordability push, two things got together somehow. So depending on who you speak with, they would tend to tell you that the FAR cap was actually entirely away from commercial vacancies, but it's not true based on couple of conversations that I've had with both state and city agency folks. The last thing that I'm going to speak about is commercial vacancy conversion is something that we should be thinking about, because that is still kind of a low-hanging fruit, in the sense that folks might want to do something about capitalizing their gain from those vacancies. So that is something that is a live conversation we should definitely engage with. That's what my.
Well, Viren, you have been very supportive of the idea of commercial conversion. I'm glad for your consistency. Thank you.
No, this is not a question of consistency. No, Paul, I have to correct you. This has nothing to do. Please let me correct you. Let me correct you. This has nothing to do with consistency. This is what is happening in the city. It is happening.
I'm joking. You're one of the reasons you're on this group is because you've done a lot of work on the commercial vacancies issues in the city and in this district. So, but keeping in mind that this is a 12 FAR working group, right? We can certainly, I think, tackle, as Carrie asked, like, let's look at commercial conversion and how 12 FAR impacts commercial conversion. Let's, the MIH formulas have been raised a number of times. So there are things that we can do, and I like David Stolnick's trigger language, right? Like, let's look at what positions do we want to carve out and say, these are the issues if the state ever does do a removal of the 12 FAR cap, these are the things that we want to make sure happen. Right, or even to say we want to push for removal of density issues on commercial conversion. We want to push for removal of density issues on high density areas in Hudson Yards and Penn Station, right? Like we can take different directions with that. But
There's just two clarifications, Paul. Number one, I'm not pushing for commercial vacancy conversion at all. I'm neither for it nor against it. All I'm saying is if it comes through, we as the board should think about it and have whatever points that we might want to raise. That's what I'm saying, number one. I'm not saying that we should do it or not do it. That's number one. Number two, the FAR cap of 12 that is not on the table anymore, when it comes back, it might have a different shape and form. So my advice, I'm still going to work in the group and I'm going to still suggest whatever guidelines you can think about. But it is a kind of a question that hasn't come up in a sort of very clear form. So we would be sort of doing all guesswork and coming up with ideas that might have to change later on. So if you're suggesting that we do that as a working group exercise, I'm for it. All I'm saying is that it might not be a letter.
what was the last part of your statement there, Vern? You're not what?
It might not have to be a letter to state.
Well, no, I think where I'm kind of at in my head is that we don't have to address the state at this point because it's off the table. But because we have had years of these conversations, that we, as a working group, should kind of think through what is it we would want as a board position on any increase in housing density, right? So we can look at and say, like the question you asked, Varen, are you for or against commercial conversion at a higher density? I mean, I think that's a question we should ask and try to come to an answer on. Would we support commercial conversion at a higher density? There's been issues about if there's, in the presentation at the panel, George James presented the City Club's proposal to create a new R11 zoning district that would require a high percentage of permanently affordable, would require community facility space, that there's a new zoning, residential zone created that would kind of force, if they ever did rezone to it was an R11 zone proposal, what is within an R11 zone to make sure that our issues are addressed. Christine has raised the point of, we have places that already have high density. Can those allow higher density housing as opposed to just high density commercial? Because right now, Hudson Yards and Penn Station have high density commercial, but they don't allow us to put more housing in there. So how do we want to tackle that? So I see that as three sort of topics for us to sort of move forward with and try to discuss.
I'm in agreement with that. I wasn't saying anything against that. What I'm saying is if we end up going in that direction, what is it as a district that we would like to make sure does take place? Whether it's a commercial conversion or it's just simply adding affordable housing in particular developments which are coming up moving forward, or if the 12 FAR cap goes up. But the last part is where I'm uncomfortable because I don't know what is happening.
Well, I mean, that's the thing, Baron, is that nothing is happening right now, right?
Correct.
Like the cap is off the table at the state level, so nothing is happening. And right now, the board has no position on that whatsoever. So if it does happen in the future, the board doesn't have a position. So what I'm proposing is that we as a working group say, and again, using David's trigger thing, right? Like, let's say we want to tackle commercial conversion do we want to support commercial conversion at a higher density than 12 FAR residential? So those buildings that are overbuilt and looking to be converted, could we allow for a greater density of housing in those buildings that are already overbuilt? Another question is, in the areas where we have high density commercial, would we support higher density residential in those areas that already have high density commercial? And then the third question I'm asking is, would we support the creation of a new zone for residential, and using the City Club example, the R11 zone, creating a new residential zoning category that allows for greater residential? And so I'm asking the group those three questions. Would you want to tackle 1, 2, and 3, or any others that came up in our various conversations? So Bobby?
Oh, I think Christine had her hand up before.
I know, but as I said at the outset, I'm
Got it.
calling on working group members
course.
before other members, so.
I appreciate that. Thank you. So one of the things that I think is helpful for framing the discussion is I just pulled up the city's zoning and land use map. And I think that we had a discussion about which parts of the district, if any, are what you would describe as R10 are already at what the city's kind of maximum residential district is, to the extent that the different residential districts exist. I think it's mostly R8 within the within Community Board 4. But Paul, do you know specifically where the R10 areas are concentrated? So I'm having some trouble finding them, and I'm kind of curious just because of Vicki Bean's presentation. If the cap were to lift and there was some interest in looking at rezoning residential areas for greater density, I think there would be some strong interest in those areas. And I'm uncertain if I know and if other folks know specifically what those areas are and what we're talking about. And then I do have answers to your other questions, but I will.
Let me just say that you're asking the same question as Christine, right? Like we should do sort of a audit of our district and see where these places exist and where we could be impacted. So that I think is an action item for something to be done before our next discussion. Where do we have high density residential that could be easily upgraded to over 12 FAR residential? I don't know of many places in the district that have that, even in our 10 zone. So I don't know. But that's like, let's do an audit of the district and find out.
Yeah,
I think that's a good point.
I think that makes sense. I do think that in particular, though, the commercial conversions based on just the need for housing and some of the older commercial space, what we've heard from the garment district, it makes sense to really take a pretty strong look at the conversions at minimum. I think that there'd be a good amount of support for that. I'm sure that there are stipulations that folks may have, but given the various sites that are available within the district, I think it makes a lot of sense. And I believe there are also office sites on 11th and 11th Avenue that would be potentially eligible for conversion. So I think there's a lot of promise there. I think it certainly makes sense on principle to promote greater density where there's the ability to absorb that. It is just a question of how to do so in a way that is, not meaningfully disruptive to the existing residents. And I think that that's where the sort of Christine audit idea comes in. It on principle, it makes sense. You just have to figure out how best to execute on that.
Yep. All right. Any other working group members have anything to add right now? I'm gonna call on Christine and Katie next. Christine?
Yeah, so of your three questions, I thought what we superficially know about the district, I think and if our objective is to generate, affordable housing, then we know that the Northern Hudson Yard has the biggest potential and probably the fastest potential because the buildings are not built yet and they don't have all of the constraints of, a conversion, right, which we know is complicated. And so I think if the group was, concentrating on that and say, let's assume a developer is coming to see us and say, I want to do one of those Hudson Yard building as a residential. The question would be how much density we would accept, and essentially what affordable housing ratio we would require. And if we can answer those two questions for those specific properties which already have a tremendous amount of, density FAR approved for commercial, where the change would not change the FAR, then I think we would have a beginning of a guideline in a sense, and that could be retrofitted into a trigger in a sense for the city or the state. We don't know yet where it would reside, but at least we could have, okay, this is what we want, right?
Yeah, Christine, I just want to clarify. You're saying retrofitting, but you're talking about new site development. Not
Yeah. That's what I mean. I'm sorry.
Okay.
I'm
All right.
sorry.
No,
I'm saying retrofitting vis-a-vis the zoning, which would go
okay.
from
Yeah.
commercial
No,
to residential.
I just wanted to make sure I was following along. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So you're saying on the new development sites in Hudson Yards North, there's currently a residential FAR cap of 6, I believe. So what density would we accept in Hudson Yards North? And if there was increased density of residential, what percentage of affordability requirements would we also? Right. Okay. Great questions.
And you could say, okay, if they are zoned for, I think they are zoned right now for FAR between 27 and 22, decreasing.
Yeah.
The question is, I mean, is there any reason not to let the whole 24, 22 be residential? Because that would produce, it's already on the books, so that would produce a lot of potentially a lot of affordable housing.
If there was a mandatory percentage of that 24 FAR to be.
Well, yeah. And then that's the next question, is that what is the mandatory percent? I mean, I personally would start at 50, assuming that somebody is going to negotiate that down, but I would definitely start at 50. So it should be really a big contribution to our policies, to our goals.
And beyond affordability, Christine, I might take a point of privilege here and say, in addition, when we have increased density housing, we need to make sure that we have not just a percentage of affordability requirements, but also community facility spaces, schools, fire, police, green space.
Right. So maybe what they do in San Francisco is, they have a fund, and they did that in the Eastern Rail Yard. You create a fund and you put money into that fund to create those things. And then the city can go around and in the neighborhood, obviously, it wouldn't be like, let's create something in Queens, in the neighborhood. And then there is a separate exercise to look at what is the what piece, and potentially you can say a piece of the building could be a school, right? Or a community facility, because then you have found the locations, so that gives you a place to put it. So
we've given increased density for schools at the base level of buildings.
Right. Exactly.
Great. Thanks, Christine. Katie, then Andrew, and then I'll come back to Roberta.
Thank you. I have 2 things. The first one, real quick. Was it stated that currently the proposal for the commercial conversion has no mandatory inclusionary component?
At the state level, there is no mandatory inclusionary housing for commercial conversions. I will just note that I think Housing, Health, and Human Services had a discussion specifically about a commercial conversion within the district that would likely utilize a J51 tax benefit, and that it would be appropriate to require affordability in that instance. The city has argued, and I think the state, there's not as much of a precedent of providing affordability without some sort of tax incentive or a way to quote unquote pay for it. And so that would be kind of the reason, or the reasoning why the city is not put forward mandatory affordability in some of these conversions, and rather is trying to use tax benefits as a way to encourage affordability instead.
Got it. Because it seems to me that our biggest focus really is on affordable housing. when that article came out that said 50% of New Yorkers can't afford their rent. I'm one of those 50%. So also on the last panel, George mentioned that most residential buildings do not even exceed the 12 FAR because to get that high, it's too expensive if they're doing affordable housing. They can't make the financing work. So I don't see how in any way lifting the FAR cap across the board solves anything in regards to affordable housing. All it will do is put up massive amounts of luxury housing because they're the ones who can afford to build higher. And also, Roberta brought up Housing, Health, and Human Services Committee. How does MCB4's affordable housing plan factor into all of this? Because I know there are areas we want to adjust zoning, like, Hell's Kitchen between 11th and 12th Avenues. Right now it's manufacturing. We want to adjust that to become mixed use or residential. I just don't understand the purpose of auditing sites for this FAR thing when we already have an affordable housing plan with zoning asks that are actual like tangible things. And correct me if I'm wrong, but does the board generally opine on hypothetical situations? Or does the board wait until that situation is presented and then to discuss the actual proposal? Because right now, since there's no actual proposal on the table anymore, it sounds like we're just trying to come up with options to feed our legislators that we'll be happy with, which is not really what I think we should be doing. We need to know, it should be the opposite way. They should say, hey, this is what we want to do. What does the community think about it?
Thanks, Katie. I'll go to Andrew and then I'll come back to working group members.
Hi. So a couple of things. One is, I believe somebody had suggested earlier that it would be useful to separate the issues connected to commercial conversions and new construction. And I would strongly second that because I think there's an entirely different universe of issues connected to each of those. And I don't think you're doing either justice by sort of debating them together. I also would say that I think it's really incumbent upon the board that if it's going to opine in any way on the possibility of the 12 FAR cap being lifted, that it must frame it by saying that the board believes that lifting the 12 FAR cap would overall do more harm than good, and that the board does not support lifting the 12 FAR cap. If the board wants to have in its pocket a list of demands or conditions should that situation arise to say, well, now that we're facing a removed FAR cap, these are the conditions that we want attached to above 12 FAR ever being used, I think that's fine. But if you just do that without opining on whether or not lifting the 12 FAR cap is a good thing, then you're sort of implicitly saying that you think it's okay to do. The last point that I would make is that I think it's mistaken to believe that only areas that are currently zoned to near the 12 FAR residential have the possibility of being zoned to above 12 FAR if the cap is lifted. And again, I will use the example of the city's most recent neighborhood rezoning, which is Soho NoHo, where the city, and Chinatown, where the city went from a 0 residential FAR to 12 in many cases. So it's very clear that the city and the real estate forces that drive much of what it does are more than willing to do very, very large increases in FAR. So don't kid yourself into thinking that if the FAR cap is lifted, we're only going to see it being applied in cases where we're already near that 12 FAR limit. That is wishful thinking at best.
Thank you, Andrew. Always appreciate it. Bobby, then Kara, then Viren.
Sure. So just a couple of things. Certainly, so I appreciate the various points that Andrew brought up, specifically the issues relating to the commercial conversions and new construction, them being somewhat distinct, it's certainly worth talking about them distinctly. I will note, just in the course of the analysis of these policies, I think the overall understanding is that while the FAR cap itself very
Is that
scary,
Bobby, is that you or me?
ultimately it would can you hear me?
Yeah, you're muddled a little bit.
No, my apologies. It would just be that it is not clear that the cap would be consistently overridden, and that this would largely be in use, in part because, as Katie mentioned, it's just a very expensive feat of engineering at times to build buildings to the bulk of 12 floor area or greater, and that developers who have interest in doing that would have to go through an entire ULURP. To other points that Katie brought up, because I think they're also really important, I do think it is worth sort of having a conversation about, and Christine also brought this up, the need for affordable housing and how to balance that with new construction or new conversions. Either way, I think it is not true that the only way to get and preserve affordable housing is to mandate it through regulatory agreements. Through the it's not a perfect system. There's not perfect filtering by any means. Markets are not there's not a perfect one-to-one, but having some degree of market rate development does mean that people with higher incomes are able to take those units and not bid up units that are currently collecting lower rent. There is a ton of demand to live here. I think we've seen that the past couple of years with amount of rental inflation, at least on the market rate level, has been just truly something that I have never seen in my lifetime, and likely is the same for a lot of folks who live here. So I think it is worth trying to figure out how to balance the need for new market rate construction and how that ultimately can support affordability, with the caveat that it's not perfect. It's not a perfect system. You kind of have to think about what is actually going there. And then final thing, in the context of the affordable housing plan, I think Katie brought up the interest in looking at 11th and 12th in the 50s in the Clinton special, that looking at an R10 district potentially. And that is one area where, if it were appropriate, it might be possible to look at additional bulk at some point in the future. This is not to say that we should do that, or it's not a prescriptive, it's just an example where you do have some a proposed R10 district where with relatively fewer current residents, where there may be some ability to absorb growth and density, and that might be something to discuss at some point within the context of the affordable housing plan.
Thanks. Carrie?
Thanks. I just wanted to, maybe not as a working group member, but as just a community board 4 member, answer a little bit of Katie's original question about why are we talking about something that's not an issue anymore. It's that it keeps coming back. So we're trying to, I don't think that anybody's made a, decision or had a vote, certainly not on whether or not this becomes something official that we send forward, but this is to try to get ahead of what will surely come back again next year, or even in a few months. And it seems to keep coming back. What's the right word? Stronger, or with more support. So we need to, I think we need to educate ourselves about it and what our position would be. So that's why. And I wanted to ask you, Paul, is it, I know you're gonna be mad at me because this is a zoning meeting and not a triple HS meeting, but I really think it would be super helpful for us to hear from somebody who can help us understand, what is possible from an affordability perspective, so that we can frame any ideas we might have with that in mind. And I just can't separate it out. And I'm really, as I've told you before, just you and I can't think about how to, surgically discuss anything, any new buildings without figuring out what the affordability piece is and increasing it. And that, maybe George James's idea to, have a 10% across the board is the right idea, but like, I don't know how to do that. So I would love to have an expert come talk to us.
That's a great idea, Carrie. And I think that the guy from Taconic did talk about that a little bit. So maybe I'll rewatch what he said in terms of, what percentage can work, because as has been pointed out, it gets very expensive to build high density buildings. And when you have an affordability component, what can you accommodate? And I seem to recall Andrew saying something specifically about that. He had an answer to that question. So I'm going to have to rewatch that panel discussion to see what he said. But I think that's a good point. All right, I'm going to call on Viren, and then we have 6 minutes left. So I'm going to go to Chris, LeBron, and then Katie. I'm going to go to Sanford, then Katie. We have to be very fast. We only have 6 minutes, and I need to wrap up for the end of the meeting. Viren?
Okay, very quickly to answer Carrie's last question. There is a way to sort of divide the component of affordability, which would allow you higher density. So if you do not meet that requirement, for example, you will not be able to have higher density. So there is already a way in which city already does that, and we can follow pretty much the same mechanism. We can refine it and define it, give it a percentage, and all kinds of cool things we can add to it into the mechanism. That's number one. Number two, Katie's question about high density necessarily means taller buildings and more expensive buildings is not necessarily true, depending on the lot size and where exactly you're doing it. If you're talking about Manhattan, I agree with you. But if you're speaking about larger blocks and lots in other parts of the city, you could achieve the same goal of higher FAR and more square feet without having to go tall. So it kind of becomes a design problem. The third thing that I'm going to state is that, and I totally agree with Carrie when she said that we should definitely think about it because this question comes at us. What I'm proposing is whether we're right or not right is a secondary issue. We should definitely think about it. We should definitely keep our talking points in place and set of arguments for and against both. I would not say only one. So we basically equip ourselves to be able to, when the time comes, to be able to write to whoever we need to write to. And that I totally agree with. What else did I want to, oh, yes. And Christine, you don't know about the commercial vacancies in our district because this community board actually did a study through CLU and it was presented only to CLU. It was not ever presented to the board. Why? I'm not quite sure. Whether I'm for it or against it, I don't know. It was done. It was a student's work, and I think it should be presented to the board, and everyone should know about it because it's a fellowship, and it's good for the student. So I'm definitely putting it on the table, Carrie. Now, I think it should be presented. He's waiting. He keeps sending emails after emails. So when am I going to present it? Anyway, and last but not the least, that study has a bunch of examples. Not exactly the best candidates because it was done by a student and he was not exactly very well equipped with coming up with proposals, but some are interesting examples that he proposed for the commercial building conversions. Like I said, I'm just going to make it quick. It's not the greatest study, but I think we should listen to it.
Yeah, can you recirculate that to this working group members, please? We send it to Jesse because I agree. I remember that, and it was flawed, but it has some good concepts.
Paul, this is being recorded, so I'm going to state it. I have recirculated it a couple of times already.
No, I know, but just let's get it back out to this group again so we can refresh.
Sounds good. Will do.
Thank you, Baron. Appreciate it. All right, Katie, I'm going to ask you to be very quick though.
Super fast. I just want to point out what Roberta was saying about competition for apartments. There is no competition for luxury apartments. There are tons of apartments over $3,000 on the market. It's the competition for the small buildings, and this doesn't solve it. Oh, this needs to be a bigger conversation. I don't like that there's not enough public comment in these working groups.
Thank you, Katie. Chris?
Yeah. I reviewed the Taconic situation. He said only 10% would be affordable and it would not be low bracket AMI. So that's one. I think, looking at other conversions, the only two that we have to study is what's happening at the old Daily News building, and then what is being negotiated at a 5 World Trade Center. Vera and I was over at Ashland in Fort Greene yesterday, and Ashland Place has actually been knocked down. Developers have purchased most of the 5-story buildings, and they're going to go high density tall. When I worked for the chair of public housing on infill, specifically in central Brooklyn, developers had no interest in going low. They only had interest in going as high as possible. And that can be seen in all Brooklyn redevelopments and rezonings where an FAR increase is taking place right now. So that's the trend.
Chris. Appreciate that. Sanford.
All right, I'll try to be quick.
Thank you.
2 points I wanted to make is, one is, I think increasing the getting rid of the state FAR cap and increasing FAR in some locations is a great opportunity to put more housing in high opportunity neighborhoods. Obviously, there's a lot of land in New York City, but there's only a few places with great public transit, great job access, great walkability, et cetera, et cetera. And it would be great to build more housing there. And often those areas are already built to R12. So I think that is a significant advantage of lifting the FAR cap and using that greater density in some locations. The other point I want to make is that about cost. I'm not an architect, I'm not an engineer, but like the primary driver of the really expensive buildings is height. It's not density. So you can build, if you build a 15-story R15 building, that's not necessarily an expensive building. And I don't know how to make that stipulate, like, and I think if you have the affordability stipulations, like 30% or 40% of the units must be affordable, and that's just the law, it has to be that way. Okay, if that means that they have to build shorter buildings to make that work, that is like the key is just to have the affordability requirement in place, and then like the building will not be built unless there is a way to do it such that you can make affordable apartments. And if that means they'll be still higher FAR but shorter, maybe that's how it'll be.
No, I agree. But I mean, if you look at Billionaires Row, those are 10 FAR with 60 units in them. So unit mix, affordability requirements, those are part of, and again, looking at the City Club proposal in the R11 zone, that does try to tackle that, as does the RPA proposal to review that. So let's, to summarize today though, what I'm hearing is that we're going to just keep walking forward and not necessarily address the state situation. We want to look at three topics really. One is commercial conversion, right? What would we accept in our district in terms of density of commercial conversion, and to make sure that we fully understand what could be converted, what the density could be like, and what we would accept. The second issue is to look at areas that have current high density in commercial. Would we accept higher density residential, and what would some of the parameters around that be? So how dense would we accept? What kind of community facilities would we want? Christine's question, would we accept a 24 FAR residential, right? Like I want people to start to tackle that issue. And then the third thing that Katie brought up is, how does this all integrate with the current housing plan? Like there is within the housing plan some rezoning proposals. Would we want to look at those rezonings to say, in those areas, let's talk about a higher density residential component so that we can allow for more affordability? And to Carrie's point, I think that none of this is discussed without understanding what requirements we have for affordability, because we as a board have always been fighting for building affordable housing. So this comes, and I think in my mind, in that context. So how do we integrate that?
One quick thing, Paul, if you don't
I saw David's hand up first, Vera. If I could let me just call on him and I'll come back to you. Thanks, David.
Yeah, I would just like, I think we need somebody who can talk about the economics of conversion. It's very important. The commercial building owners are in big trouble. Many of them are going to lose their buildings. They go back to the bank. Their loans are coming. we've sort of not seen how much trouble they're in yet, despite the, the huge vacancies. But we're going to. Their loans are coming due, leases are ending. And so we need to be very careful about imposing. I'm all for inclusionary housing, but for this particular category, the conversions, we need to be very careful about suggesting impositions of adding new requirements for inclusionary housing without having heard from somebody who understands the economics of conversion. It's extremely expensive to turn offices are basically just big open spaces.
I hear you.
Residential is very intense.
So we want to hear about the economics of conversion and the economics of building a percentage of affordable. So it's
Yes.
both of those issues, both, because Carrie, to your point, we want to understand what are the economics of building affordable housing. So I like that. I'll work on trying to find somebody for each of those. Let me go to Vera next, Bobby, and then I'll come back to you. Vera?
Just very quickly, FAR is a kind of oxymoron, so we really have to be careful about what we want to talk about there, because it does not really produce a greater yield between 10 and 12. So that is something, that's one of the reasons why they're not speaking about FAR 11 by and large. Second thing, when we talk about affordability, we always talk about affordability from the point of view of the district, but we never link it to the AMI, and I mean lower AMI. So I think we should always combine the two as a board, but even for this particular conversation, when we're talking about more affordable housing, it has to include lower AMI as well.
I think it integrates well with the housing plan discussion, Vera. That's where I think that's where those two kind of parallel. Bobby?
Oh, I just wanted to note that we did get, or I've seen different analyses from HRNA and then from REBNY and then from other, I think there's one more for commercial conversions that I can send you. Those might be places to look for.
Sure. Thank you. That would be helpful. All right, so the one thing I'm not hearing, Pamela, I'm sorry, you can be very fast. We're beyond our hour. I'm trying to wrap this up. So if you have something to say very quickly, go ahead. Unmute.
Just from a very innocent, ignorant point of view here, I am infuriated with the statistic having to do with rent stabilized apartments that are being warehoused now. Do we have any idea how many in MCB4 there are? And wouldn't it make sense to say we are not going to raise this cap until our government figures out how to get those apartments available for the market and get them rented to the people who need them? Thank you.
Thank you, Pat.
Thousands.
So the issue is, so what I'm also, to summarize from today as well, so we're not going to try to tackle the state. We're going to tackle these three issues. It doesn't sound like anybody was really interested in talking about a citywide zoning like an R11 category, which, to be honest, I'm happy if we don't try to tackle that, because as one community board of many, for us to propose a zoning change would be quite cumbersome. I think I'd rather have us just stay focused on our district. And so to try to tackle the questions we have that impact us. And look at commercial conversion issues, look at high density areas that only allow for commercial and don't allow for enough residential. And then how that integrates into our housing plan, which is a push for increased affordability. I will work on trying to find information on the economics of building affordable housing and on the economics of commercial conversion, and either send everybody in the working group data that you can look at yourself, or if we can find somebody who's willing to come and present to us, I can work on that. Is there somebody from the working group willing to look at what are some of the local zoning constraints that we currently face? I think, Bobby, was it you that asked where are the high density residential areas in our district now?
Sure, and we can, I'm happy to pull up the zoning map and just highlight those items. I'm also sure Joe wants to come. He probably could cite those in his sleep. So.
Right.
You might already, I might be able to hand it over to you.
Varen, you might be able to do that?
No, I think we might have a map. I think I should be able to find one.
Okay, yeah, let me know. Let's you and I connect on that.
Yeah,
the city has an interactive map. It's called the zoning and land use map, and you can see them, the different overlays. It's super helpful.
Yeah, but one of the questions though is that although it might be zoned a certain category, is there is it built to that capacity, right? Like, so that's one of knowing what the zones are doesn't make as much of an impact to me as knowing the zones that are already at capacity or near that capacity, right? And to Andrew Berman's point, look at the Hudson Yards zone. It has an R6 cap right now, so just to get that to 12 might be enough for us. But do we want to go to 24? So that's so for the next meeting then, let's hone in specifically on the conversion of commercial. All right, like let's make that our focus topic, and we'll keep that separate then, and have a subsequent conversation on new development in high density areas and whether or not we want to increase density for residential in the high density areas that exist. So we'll have two topics for next working group.
Okay, can I just one quick thing I can
I'm sorry, I can't hear you, Baron.
sorry, Christine and Paul, there's only one thing. In an existing high density commercial zone, you can build residential, but you cannot meet the same cap. In the sense, if you have a block which has an FAR of 33 and you want to build residential, there is an equivalent R7, R10, whatever that might be. That's what you can build. That mechanism is already in place. So basically what Christine is asking for is a way to change that.
Correct. Correct. So, Viren, at the end of next meeting, I'd like for you to be able to say you are in support of or opposed to conversion of commercial at a greater density, because you started this meeting by saying you didn't have a position. So I'd like for us to start thinking about taking these sorts of positions.
Okay, sure.
All right.
It would be more nuanced than that, Paul, right? I mean,
No nuance at all, Carrie. There's no affordability in any commercial conversion whatsoever, period. End of discussion. No, of course, nuance is our game. That's what we love. We love nuance.
Yeah,
All right.
absolutely.
All right.
thank you.
Thank
All right.
you.
Very good. Thank you, everybody. We'll see you in a week or two, whenever the next one is scheduled.
Sounds good.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody. Thanks,
Bye.
Janine.
And Viren, I'll talk to Jessica again about the presentation. I apologize.
No worries. It's just that
No, you totally called me out, so I'm gonna.
Hey, Janine, Carrie, can you stay on for a second? And